Thank you. It's so lovely to see so many of you students and faculty. And we have some special guests as well who are joining us in person but also online, right? So we're getting started super promptly also for our Zoom guests. So, okay, so most of you in the room certainly know me, but for anyone who might not, my name is Stephanie Nadalo, and I'm the director of the Bachelor of Fine Art, Media and Technology. It is my absolute pleasure for us to be hosting this event today here with my esteemed colleague, Evan Roth. So we're going to hear in the next 45 minutes about his incredibly impressive international career. It spans many diverse media, paintings, installations, video, website. It spans several continents and 2 decades. And if you didn't know, I'll tell you. So Evan's work is now featured in some very prominent collections. So among others, the MoMA in New York City. He's also, of course, exhibited at many other institutions, Whitehall Chapel, the Jeu de Paume here in Paris, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. So that's a very impressive list of institutions, to which we can now add Gallery 45. So we are incredibly excited for those of you joining us in person that, as you probably noticed when you entered, we have his Skyscape series on view right now, which is an immense honor. And how exciting is it that we're going to hear about his work and his bits of wisdom as we explore his creative journey. So I'm just going to give a few kind of chronological interesting points here, and then he's going to tell you more. So in case you didn't know, Evan did his undergraduate degree in architecture before going on to complete an MFA on the Parsons New York campus in design and technology. So he is, in that way, not only a faculty member, so we are so lucky to have him as one of the co-instructors for senior thesis, but he's also, in a larger way, a product of the Parsons pedagogy in a larger way. He has many accomplishments, and you'll hear, I think, interestingly about the conceptual work behind them, but he was the co-founder in 2006 of the Graffiti Research Lab and the Free Art and Technology Lab. He has been awarded many important prizes, but something to mention is Art Angels Everywhere Commission. Now, his studio is now based in Berlin, but of course we're very lucky that he comes to Paris to continue teaching here. And before I pass things over to Evan, one just little point of logistics. So he's going to talk for about 45 minutes, so save up all your questions here in the audience. Also, those of you joining us online, I don't know where the camera is, please feel free to use the chat and put questions there. We're then going to have a kind of discussion afterwards. And yes, exactly. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Evan Roth.
Thanks so much for the introduction. That was really nice. I am going to, so yeah, everybody knows me, Evan, artist. Hello everybody on Zoom. I'm going to talk about, I realized in putting together this talk, first of all, that I graduated in 2005, which makes this like my big 20 years of having graduated from Parsons, 20 years of teaching between the New York and the Paris campus, 20 years of being a professional artist. So anyway, for a little minor personal victory, I made it 20 years. So I thought that would be like maybe a little theme for the talk. Would be basically linearly, chronologically going through the work I was doing, starting from back in New York when I was a student in the MFA DT program to the work I'm doing now. I'm gonna talk about themes in my work, but I wasn't gonna like have the talk go through the themes necessarily. So I'll just point them out to be aware of, and they'll come and go. But like, one thing that a lot of my work has to deal with, and I'm mentioning this because a lot of the projects are going to look really different, different mediums have different intents, but some of these themes are like agency, thinking about personal agency within public space in the beginning of the work I'm going to talk about, and then also within more like the media landscape. Openness, I kind of come from, I don't know, the free software movement was a big inspiration for driving me out of that architecture practice and into the arts. I'll talk about that, but kind of like sharing of knowledge, open systems, those are big for me. I'm interested in sort of unseen and unintended aspects of technology, like misuse of technology is something that's going to come up. and then thinking about how bias gets embedded within systems. How does ideology get embedded within images, within software, within systems, and how can we be aware of that? It's another theme that will come up. So those are the general themes. I'll try to bring them in and out a little bit, but mostly I'm going to go chronologically. So I'm going to start here in the early 2000s. This was the internet that was presented to me when I was, your age. It was a very, very different internet. And I mean, so this is the time I had graduated from University of Maryland. I was doing architecture. I was working in DC for a couple of years, and LA for a couple of years. And I was moonlighting on the internet. I was like really inspired by a lot of people that were making things out of code. For me, for the first time that I'd seen Flash, like this new animation interactivity had just come to the web. I thought that was really cool at the time. But then what was the thing that I thought was the most interesting, really drove me out of architecture, was peer-to-peer networks, essentially. Like the fact that like these communities of people were popping up where they were the community, but they were also the infrastructure. Like they weren't reliant on the servers of other people. You were uploading while you were downloading. It was like a technical point, but it was also kind of like a social point. And they were sharing things. So this was big to me. It was like an example of something beyond capitalism. Like people sharing things for reasons that weren't immediately clear to me. Like why did the Pirate Bay just give me every book, every movie, every piece of software, every piece of music? That felt like an incredible gift to me at the time, still does. And so this was going on, and to me I was realizing I was more interested in this than what I was doing with my budding architecture career. So that was kind of what drove me into the arms of Parsons and into New York. That was a switch. I was in LA at the time, so I moved to New York. And okay, so this is an unseen piece. I was recently in my mother-in-law's basement in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., tasked with cleaning out her basement, and I found the first thing I ever made at Parsons, okay? This is not on my website, this is not my best work, but I thought fitting to show here. So yeah, this is the first thing I made in studio class, and it was, I had just read the book, 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television. I don't know if anybody knows this book. Very different idea about screen time, but essentially this was an hourglass where it was 2 TVs filled with sand, and you could flip it and watch for 30 minutes, like, and then flip it and watch for 30 minutes. And so it was like, this was also kind of my first art piece, because before I was really more in the design practice. I was really more in architecture. My schooling and education was all design practice, and so this was kind of like a tiptoe into making kinetic sculpture, let's say. So this was, I had to share it because I had nobody else to share it with, so I don't think it exists anymore. I think I took that video and then now it's gone. The work I was doing when I was there that maybe I'm more excited to share in a different way was, so I was getting introduced to practices of open source and code and writing and all that. That was like one community I was getting introduced to, but also being in New York City was big for me at the time, and like also just like commuting between downtown Brooklyn and lower Manhattan, and like getting introduced to all this graffiti, and graffiti became a really big influence for me, so I started taking a lot of pictures, meeting people within that community. And the first pitch for my thesis was this project called Graffiti Taxonomy, and this was coming from me reading like Edward Tufte books like crazy, so it's very much kind of like a data visualization project that falls within, he would describe it as small multiples, but the premise was I would take these photos, I would clean them in Photoshop, removing them from the context, like a cardinal sin of any graffiti practice, and then I would take a tag, I would isolate a letter in red, and then I would blow it up, and like this Tufte idea of like, when you want to see the differences between something, if you render them in a similar language, the differences are more likely to pop out, right? So the idea was scale, color, these were things I made a commonality between, they were rendered so you could just see how different people at one moment in time in one neighborhood were all dealing with gesture, like how the letter S was written by different people in this one place at this one time. And then I would kind of publish those results in the city also. So I would take those, print them out, put them up around the city, and those became kind of a dialogue that was happening. That work turned into my actual thesis project, which was called Graffiti Analysis, and where this was kind of looking at a visual form. My thesis was looking more at the kind of movement of graffiti, like treating graffiti as a performance art rather than a visual art, like thinking about how gesture and the human body are involved in making the shape, and like everything that goes into the practice that dictates that movement, right? Like And also that movement being something that if you're outside the community you never get to see, like unless you're going out and writing or going out with writers, like this really beautiful part of that practice that you never get witnessed. You get to see the ink on the wall the next morning, but you don't get to see this sort of performance of it all. And so my thesis was essentially open source software. Like I designed software that I would use to then invite graffiti writers to come to my apartment or other places and use this system. I was really big on like, I didn't want to hand them a mouse or a stylus. Like that was like, from the day one of my thesis, I was like, I cannot hand them a stylus. Like that can't be what this project is about. So a lot of the technology was like, how can I come up with a system where they can bring in their own tools? Because you'll see later, like tools in the graffiti community to me are specifically very interesting. So like, how could I have them bring in their own tools and use that to be their interface? I don't have to hand them something else. And so the results was motion visualization, essentially. Like it's kind of like you're writing on something that's pulling away, so you can see how it's stacking up in 3D. The width has to do with speed, so the faster it's moving, the thinner it gets. The particles are dealing with changes in velocity, so you can sort of see where spikes are or curves are. And then, so it's building this sort of database of all this graffiti writing, and then those results, similar to the other one, were also kind of published in the city. So I would do these performances where I would project the output from that, like project the motion back into the city, and that was kind of like trying to complete that loop of like this gift of the project sort of being so people could see this motion that like they weren't able to see, like another way of sort of looking at graffiti. So that was graffiti analysis, and so that's what I graduated with. And that work was what I applied to I-Beam with, which is an art nonprofit in New York that still has a really amazing residency and fellowship program. So I applied with this work and got this fellowship at I-Beam, which then bought me another year, which they extended to 2 years. So I kind of had this extra 2 years after graduation, which for me was huge. And I made a bunch of projects during that time, but the kind of, I don't know, one that sticks out is this, like I co-founded this group called Graffiti Research Lab, which was sort of an extension of my thesis, but it was connected in the sense that like I was really interested in this dialogue between people that are dealing with new technologies, but then also seeing similarities with how graffiti writers also had their own technologies and their own way of making tools, and sort of having a dialogue between those two groups. And so the Graffiti Research Lab's mission was like, okay, we're gonna enable other people. Like we're gonna make tools, we're gonna deal with the decreasing cost of technology and how once they cross a certain threshold, you can sort of use them outside in a way where if you have to leave it, you can. But we were mostly going to be making tools in support of like graffiti writers, street artists, and activists. Like it wasn't going to be, we were going to pick what messages we spread, but the idea was we weren't going to be spreading our own messages. And so one of those projects was called Laser Tag. This was, again, free software. So like one idea was like a way to sort of promote openness ideas. We would make these videos that would hopefully have some kind of spread through the internet, but then we'd always tie to it either free software or if it was a hardware project, like instructions on how to recreate what we were doing hardware-wise. So this was kind of both. It was a software project, and the hardware side was like, it was using, I mean, now very basic motion capture stuff, but at the time it felt really high-tech. And I mean, beyond the tech, like what was interesting about thinking back about this project, which then led to all these performances, we go to these different cities and get to meet with different activists and different graffiti writers. It was very social, and so the idea was we would set this system up, we would invite people to come, and then in this case the interface was just this laser, and so we would just hand the laser around and people would hang out and they would talk and they would write and they would pass, and it was just became this kind of like, there was the social side of it, and then the question was, here's me biking around, and the system had it all mounted on the bike, and so we traveled with this project, and it was, in some cases it was graffiti writers, and sometimes it was activist groups, and it kind of, we did other projects, but this one was one that really felt like we were sort of both supporting groups that we were working with directly, but then also supporting groups that were downloading our stuff off of the website or downloading our how-to guides and recreating them. And people were like using this, and we would see evidence of it happening in different countries and on YouTube. And this was sort of pre-social media. In some degree, it was almost pre-YouTube. Like YouTube was really coming in around this time, but like we weren't engaged in it that much. It was like a different internet. It was a different way of spreading, but like what we realized at the time, and this will take me into the next one, was we sort of transitioned that group to, so now we're like 2007 to 2015, co-founded this other group called the Free Art Technology Lab, or FAT Lab. And the reason we did that is because, like, through doing that graffiti research lab work, like, we were interested in a lot of the public space work, but what was more interesting to us is that people hadn't, like, the whole idea of viral was like just being, like, that term was just being coined, like people hadn't figured out how to monetize that yet, let's say, and so what we thought was there was this like loophole where like we realized that the projects we were doing were spreading further than we thought that they would, and it wasn't like it was that difficult. I mean, now it's super hard to break through the noise. Back then it was to some degree too, but like you weren't competing with people trying to make money, let's say. And so what we realized is like that was maybe more powerful than the tools we were making. And so this group was more about, okay, if we focus just on that, like focus on engaging with this new pop culture that's happening on the internet and trying to make content that would feed into that system and people would post on blogs and it would start to spread, then we could tie in the sort of more activist driven messages that we were interested in spreading to that kind of content, which at the time felt kind of new. Like now it's like this whole, I mean, you could do this as a profession now, but at the time it was like people weren't really doing that quite as much. And so we did a lot of projects. This was one where we made a fake Google Street View car. Just to contextualize this was at a time when Google's like, their public messaging was Google is not evil. Like that was their advertising campaign for a while, which now seems like a joke, but back then like we were interested in like getting people talking more about data monopolies and what people were doing with your data. Now that obviously people are much more aware of that discussion now, but at the time that was what we were trying to drive. And so yeah, we built this fake Google Street View car. This is in Berlin, what feels like many years ago now. And then on Twitter, which was around at this time, we had tweeted that Fat Lab had placed an illegal GPS tracker on a Google Street View car. We were tracking it and we were filming it. And so we would film it like getting lost. I mean, it's us faking it, right? The car is like, it's just a car we rented and we bought this roof rack off of eBay. Everything above the roof rack's just cardboard and duct tape. There's no technology in the car. And then we would just like act fools. Like we would act like we were breaking down in the middle of Kreuzberg. There's like, I forget some of the other ones, like, this was the drinking and driving thing. Like, we caught the Google cars drinking and driving, and we put that online. And so this was like, I can tell more stories. But anyway, this was like the kind of content we were making. It was like fun, it was meant to spread through this blogosphere, but it was then tied to these other messages that would hopefully try to...
Oh, please finish that video.
I forgot this was on there. Anyway, we were trying to get a dialogue going. So that was Fat Lab. Then moving forward a few more years now, so there was this group surrounding graffiti research labs, surrounding Fat Lab, Open Frameworks, which was started by Zach Lieberman, also Parsons teacher and alum. That community was around here, and so this was a project that we all sort of teamed up together to do. So it was called the iWriter Project. It was working with Tony Kwan, 10th One, who's a graffiti writer. In the 90s, he was like really influential in Trollo style graffiti that was happening around the LA River. And he was diagnosed with ALS, and he was completely paralyzed. ALS leaves you with only eye movement, and so like the idea was we could team up with him to develop this system, open source software, and open hardware project for like how could we make a system that he could use to make graffiti again, using the only inputs that he had available, which was essentially eye movement, blinking, and pausing. Those were our kind of three mechanics we could use in the software. There's other Parsons alum now here too. This is Theo Watson and Chris Segru. They were also on the team, also Parsons alum. And so, I mean, I'll just click through a little bit. It was this camera system where we were kind of using a hacked PlayStation 2 camera, I think at the time, with like an infrared filter and some infrared lights to get a clean image of the eye. And then there's some footage of what it looks like for him to do the drawings now. He could basically make a letter, make one at a time. It's a slow process, but in the end working with him, like he was really the one kind of driving it, being like, okay, I need this, it needs to work this way. We developed this software that would allow him to make what he wanted to make. And so then we had a couple nights where we did we had one team that they had a car driving around LA and projecting kind of along the freeways, and then he was in the hospital room drawing, making graffiti, and he would then send it to that team, and then the team in the city had a webcam that they would feed it back to him. So like from his hospital room, you can kind of see on the left, he would compose something, send it, and then he could look and see a live stream of it being projected around LA. So it was like this way for him to sort of be making graffiti in the city again. Just some more footage. So that was the iWriter project. And that kind of like, that little sequence of earlier work obviously has a lot to do with public space, a lot to do with free software, free speech issues. At the same time, all that was going on though, like I also was making, that was also very collaborative work. I also had like, throughout that whole period, I also had a solo practice where I was just tinkering and making my own things. And in addition to being influenced by what was happening in technology circles and public space, also very influenced by the net art scene. The period of the net art scene is maybe like second or third wave that I was a part of. I wasn't part of that initial wave that was really defining it, but I was influenced by that group with like Jody and Oli Lee Lena. But there was another scene that popped up around Delicious, which was this like link sharing service. It was like one of the first tag-based social, it was almost a social network, but it was a way where people were sharing links, and there was an interesting sort of net art scene that was happening using Delicious, and so much interesting stuff happening around that time period. And so I was really influenced by what was going on with that. So I was also looking at a lot of net art, making a lot of net art, seeing a lot of connections between net art scene and the graffiti scene, both like essentially performance-based practices in my thinking of them anyway. So I'll show just like one example. This was from a series I did called No Original Research, which started as surfing Wikipedia for animated GIFs, and then when I would find GIFs, I would download them and I would copy them a bunch of times and change the file name so that when I would load them all back into a browser, the browser would treat it as if they were different files, right? And so this is one where I found some animated GIF of some kind of crank system. So the browser's now trying to load them all, right? And it can't do it perfectly because there's latency in the system. There's differences in hardware on the laptop, there's differences in the browser, there's difference between the internet connection, and so it loads it in this like imperfect way, right? And so what you end up seeing is not this perfect circle that's undulating all in sync with itself, but you're seeing almost like this visualization of this data's path through that whole infrastructure cycle. And so it becomes, in my thinking, a way also of, yeah, like getting back to that unseen idea, like visualizing this unseen path that the data happens as it goes through. Because net art was really, at its core, it was about thinking about how do you, I'll talk about this later, but like really art on the net, in the net, like between connected computers, not just a photo or documentation that's shared through the web, but it's really like how do we make work that's like involving the web as a medium. Okay, so that was some net art stuff. I was also doing more physical work that were IRL work that had to deal with thinking about some of these issues. This was from a series called Multi-Touch Paintings, and this was a really simple premise too. I would just take tracing paper and I would put it over my phone, and then I would ink my finger, and then I would just do mechanics that the phone was asking me to do. Like this one's called Slide to Unlock, right? And this one too is like interesting to look at now because I remember even at the time I made this, like it felt very new and hip and fresh. I'm like, oh wow, look at how my phone opens. Slide to Unlock is so crazy. But I remember thinking at the time too, it always felt clunky. It always felt like, okay, this is a weird moment within the life cycle of this technology where we're doing this thing. We're doing this like humans are doing this thing for the first time ever, like 100 times a day, right? There's no time in human civilization we did that 100 times a day until now. So there's something awkward about it, but also new at the same time. And so I was thinking about archiving when I made it, like making a piece that would sort of like have some interest of people in that moment in 2014, looking at that gesture, but then also like now looking back on it, I mean now my phone doesn't even have Slide to Unlock. Some of the other ones, this one's a diptych, so this one's like zoom in, zoom out. This one still a function we use, obviously. This one's next, still very useful, right? I've done scroll also. There's like, it's meant to be, yeah, making this way of sort of visualizing these gestures that we're sort of being trained to do through the devices that we interact with. And yeah, it connects to that idea of like both visualizing some of these unseen things, but also archiving is another interest I have. I think this next one is also an archiving project. So keeping in with this sort of archiving and visualizing internet-based works, I got really interested in the cache directory on our computers as like this place that you're probably all familiar, right, when you're on a web browser and you have this cache that's stored locally, temporarily. It's like a place on our computers that's by default invisible, which is interesting. Like you have to enable it to even see it. And then it's also one of the few places on our computers that are overwritten by default. Like as you surf through the web, it's constantly overwriting itself by default. And so that was sort of interesting to me just as as a condition, computing condition. And so I had this really simple script that would just, instead of erasing by default, it would archive them by default. It would kind of every week make a zip file of everything that came through my browser. And so I did this piece with it called Since You Were Born. So this is my daughter Aya. And so the premise for the work was I would print out everything that went through my browser from the moment she was born until the space would fill up. And so I think this one was like 3.5 months of data. And so my thinking on this piece was like a few things. Like one was, the idea of like pairing it to her birth, and this gets back to, we've talked about this in the classroom about what a title can do in terms of like, a title is like this gift you get to give your work to provide easy context, right? So the title for this piece, tying it to her birth, was meant to like, for me anyway, it was like a way of making a measuring stick to look at all this junk with. Like her as something that I don't question the importance of. It's like a super meaningful moment in my life that I don't question the meaning of. And then my interactions with the internet, sometimes the opposite, something I question on a daily basis. Like in terms of like, how meaningful is this? Where do I stack it up with things that I consider meaningful? And so I've done this installation a few times. This first one's 2019. This was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville. This was a little Easter egg where like, this photo I put underneath the stairs as like this, it's the only image that crosses that line, so that like interested viewers who were really paying attention and went under the stairs could find this like reference back to her where it sort of started. This was at the Jeu de Paume. This was like the last thing in my memory before COVID. Like I remember this opening happening, and then the next day COVID kind of locked everything down. So yeah, that's what I think of when I look at this image. I think this lasted for like a week. Anyway, this is now something that I have installed other places. It's one that I get invitations to do, and it sort of it's sort of the same piece in these different places, but it changes with the room, and then it changes with the people. And it's been interesting to watch people interact with it. Like I remember the very first time I installed it, and like the second day it was open, it was like people like filming Instagram stuff in there and doing selfies. And my initial reaction was like, oh man, like that's not what this was for, really. But then I've totally changed my thinking on that now, and I think that's now when I see people kind of doing the selfie moment in the work, I actually really like that. I think it's like people inserting themselves in the work, because the piece was I never really wanted the interesting part about this work to be this like voyeurism thing. Like I don't think I'm that interesting. I don't think the interesting things should be pouring through. The interesting thing should not be about me. It's more about like people, I think, having this recognition that this room exists for all of us, right? We all leave these data trails, and now as companies are getting better and better about monetizing them, it has implications for different things. But like I think people realize that pretty quickly, that like, okay, this is something that exists for me. I'm just not seeing it. And then I also like this sort of meta thing that happens when people do selfies, where then the photo ends up on the web, and then it shows up in other people's browsers, and then all this cache data ends up in their cache directory, so the cycle sort of can continue. Okay, that leads me to second half. Okay, this is now up to like, let's say 2016. So I'm going to show 3 more series, and these 3 series are ones that I sort of see as like kind of connected on this like land, earth, and sky theme. And it starts with a series called Landscapes, which when it's installed, it looks like this. It's essentially, I call them network located videos. They're videos that exist within the network that you view online. They have this physical presence sometimes, and they're landscape essentially, but they're all filmed at fiber optic cable landing locations. So these like beaches where the fiber optic cables come out of the sea and meet the land. Like that's where these landscapes are filmed. And to give context to that, and if when you look at this slide, you could picture that at first slide of like that redheaded kid surfing the web in the whatever 2000s. Like I've grown a little bit through this period up to now, and the web has definitely grown and changed into a different person. And so I had this moment when I was beginning this work where I was like really questioning, okay, do I really want, like, me making work that involves the web so much is a choice. I don't have to be doing that. I can make it work about something else. And as the web was like becoming more monetized, it was centralizing. It was like no longer this peer-to-peer network and quirky homepages. It was like condensing more and more down to just like Amazon and Google and a few other servers. It was no longer this like, the Big Bang was now like imploding, right? And then at that moment too is when the Snowden files were leaked and like the NSA GCHQ spying scandal came out, which was like, in one hand, I remember everyone's reaction being like, yeah, okay, that sounds about right. And then on the other hand, it's like, oh man, but okay. All that stuff we thought was kind of happening was like kind of even worse than we thought. So that was a heavy blow. So between those like three things was like this like triangle of disaster for me in the web. And so this landscape series came from that. It was really like, my thinking on it was like, before I give up on net art and before I give up on thinking about the web as this interesting medium, like let me try to do something that's cognizant of all that, but sort of resetting my relationship with thinking about it. It's no longer this like very optimistic, I don't know, younger me being like, oh man, the web's gonna make us all have a voice in society, it's gonna be great, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I can have some understanding that maybe didn't all come true, maybe some of it helped, but there's this other system of control now. And so my way of dealing with that was like thinking about the web. There was authors talking about this at the time too, thinking about this thing we all know now, okay, the web's not a cloud, we all know that, right? Thinking about the infrastructure of the web and like to tie it back into that idea of like personal empowerment in a way. Like for me, thinking about shifting my thinking on the web to understand it as something physical, like understanding a little bit more about how it functions on a technical level, but then much more how it functions on a global scale, like where is it, what nation states define it, like which corporations define it, who owns the cables, like those kind of issues, like even though they're less fun to think about than like cat videos and animated GIFs, they're like, it helped me feel a little bit more empowered within that landscape. And so I went out on one of these like internet pilgrimage journeys that other people have done too. And this first one was to Cornwall, so this is the westmost coast you can get to in the UK. And this is, I think it's still today, like if you want to stand on top of the most data globally, these are where all those fiber optic cables are coming into Europe from North America, from all over the world. And so the two things that hit me on that first trip were like, one, you get these like, you're going out on this trip maybe to like have this experience with massively connected systems, and then you get to these really lonely, quiet beaches. And it's kind of by design in the sense that when engineers are picking where they want those cables to come up, it's much cheaper for them to put it in a place that's like not around harbors and boats and fishing nets and anchors than it is to like encase that cable in concrete and barbed wire. And so there's like baked into these landscapes is like this idea that like massively connected systems usually come up in extremely remote locations. And so that like dichotomy of a landscape to me was like super interesting. And then the second thing was, this is a photo I took on that first trip, and this is maybe hard to see, but this is like a 1970s wooden yellow fading signpost that just says telephone cable on it, which to me is like a glorious understatement to what's happening like just below feet, you know? But then it's like right next to this like World War II military bunker, and so this like proximity of connected systems and then power and history also was like on this beach very apparent. And then the more it came into my research practice, the more interesting thinking about our network as not something that just came out of nowhere, it's not this clean white box or something, but it's connected to history, it's connected to power structures. And so I left that trip knowing I wanted to do more on this project. And then I know one thing you've heard me talk about a lot is like this old art trick of like the media having importance to what the work is. And so I was really thinking like, okay, what is, if I want to document these landscapes, what is a more appropriate medium to be documenting that landscape in? Because at the time I was doing these black and white photos. I actually had all these ghost hunting devices. That's a whole nother story. But I came back thinking, looking at the research, and I landed on this number 1550 nanometers, and this is a measure of distance. It's like 1/50th of a human hair. It's a very short distance. It's the distance between peaks that the internet, they call it multiplexing, but essentially like the frequency range that fires through fiber optic cables is this frequency range, and it sits within the near infrared region. So like if this little band here is visible light, it's in this region just outside of visible light, and so this is what fires through fiber optic cables. And so that to me was interesting, and I figured out too that like other people have made these really great tutorials on how to do this, but essentially every digital camera can natively sense in a part of this region, but they put on this blue infrared blocking chip so that the infrared light doesn't mess up the color profile. And if you take the camera all the way apart, which is stressful to see it all spread out, and you pop this off and replace it with just a piece of glass, what you see then when you look through the viewfinder are images like this, which are not, so this isn't colorized or like post-processed. It isn't just like putting a red filter in the camera. This is now, the camera is now registering that infrared light, which you can, this photo isn't a great example for, but like leaves, organic matter, for example, reflects infrared light more than visible light. So you can see how this is becoming a little bit brighter than it would be normally. And so then this camera became the lens that I was using to document those landscapes with. So it wasn't magic, it wasn't X-ray vision, you couldn't see under the ground or anything. Also, the project I decided early on wasn't going to be about like a photo documentarian's approach to it. I wasn't interested. I was personally interested when I would find the cable. For me, I'd have a little private moment on the beach and be, yeah, I can see it or can touch it, you know. But it wasn't about necessarily going and finding it and reporting back. It was more like, and I think I've talked about this too, like building a set of research that becomes the scaffolding that then I can go out into the field. And this is, I was going then visiting all these beaches. So this is from Cape Town, I think. And then when I'm there with that lens, you know, I'm there for this set of reasons. I have this lens for a set of reasons, and then I can sort of just let the lens float, and it can be a little bit more free, a little bit more allowing intuition back into the work. And so the work in a sense was like more personal in how it was shot than just like seeing the cable and coming home. Thinking about medium, like the way the work functioned, URLs were like the title of the work. They were seen in a browser. So let's see if my internet's doing here. So if I open this one up as an example, they open like this. They're very, very slow. I mean, in this one you can only kind of see the waves moving maybe a little bit, or a bird coming into the frame. So they're video that are happening on the web, very, very slow video happening on the web. So I shoot these tripod videos with this infrared camera, and then I would put those videos, so in this case, I would rent a server in Cape Town, and I would put this video on that server in Cape Town, so that when users would go to this URL and come to the piece, they would essentially be, you know, traveling through fiber optic cable, through infrared light, and because we're looking at this video, there's a server in Cape Town now with a little green LED blinking. It would be no different if it was just playing off of the hard drive, but like conceptually, this is kind of the idea in the work that like the viewer then activates this infrared path between them and the landscape, and the URL is meant to be like a little bit of a clue to that, where if it's this like dual address where it's an address within the network where when you click it, it takes you there, and then it's also an address within the globe as a GPS one. So if you like paste that into Google Maps, you can, this is like another way of like exploring a NetArt piece, is like digging in a little bit, looking at the source code. And so this is the GPS coordinate of where that camera was when the piece was made, so you can kind of hunt around here and see if we can find, yeah, here it is, this nice little shot. So it's like another way of navigating that by using the title again of the work as this clue to this dual sort of landscape idea. So again, thinking about how the network butts up against history, and another reason why the work is red beyond the technical reason is that it's meant to connect back to the network's predecessor, which is the all red line. Maybe many of you have seen this image before, but this is essentially the first cable to circumnavigate the globe. It was a project of the British Empire. It was like a military advantage. Like, the reason it's called the all red line is because it's only landing in territories controlled by the British at the time, and they had this practice of coloring red with these colonial territories, and so the all red line was this line connecting these red territories. They called it the Empire Girdle at the time. And so, as an example of like how these systems are not devoid of ideology and bias and history and power structures, like our modern network is based entirely on this network, right? And a lot of like those beaches like Cape Town, like Cornwall, are the exact same beaches. Like the beaches in Cornwall in the winter, when the beach gets eroded, you can even see this cable like poking out of the sand. So it's like really like the networks are intertwined in a way that's beyond sharing space, but they're they share this history. And so when I'm exhibiting the work, so this was the show I did in Paris in 2017, I'm looking for those ways to sort of reference the history of all this. So in this case, like taking advantage of the architecture of the space, or like the arrangement here is this like salon style arrangement that was typical in that period of time. So it's like ways of trying to like get this dialogue going between not just thinking about networks or depictions of landscape, but like having that dialogue be connecting them to the history, and like having it be like a part of an ongoing dialogue of landscape rather than just, oh, here's this new thing I made. But my hope is that these works would exist and be able to be, and I've exhibited them in the past actually with paintings, historic paintings, so that dialogue is something that's like not two separate things, but like one step in an ongoing process of landscape-based image making. Okay, strands, how much time do I have? Oh, I gotta go quick. I might skip some stuff. So strands, so this is like a painting series that's based on software. It's going to look very different than the landscapes one, but the handoff to me is this idea of thinking about how ideology gets embedded within images. Like I started really falling in love, or maybe falling in love is the wrong way, but I really was getting fascinated by one aspect of the landscape-based images, in that they were very good at hiding things. Like they're the images you see in like dentist's office for a reason, because they seem very safe, but like once you geek out on them and start peeling back the layers, like they tell a lot about ownership, labor, nationalism, fascism. Like a lot of these things hide just below the surface when we're talking about landscape images a lot. And so I was dealing with maps a lot in the research, and in some cases making maps of my network and thinking about these issues, and I was looking for a visual system that was more like, I don't know, literally front and center with how it's talking about that idea of hidden ideology or biases. And maps kind of in a certain way do this, right? Like who gets the center of the map, who gets the top of the map. Like the map maker is very present in those ways that maps tell stories, and maps are narratives just like every other image. And so I got into this world of cartography, and specifically mapping projections, which is the mathematics that take the sphere and flatten it. So there's all these different ways of doing that that go back to Ptolemy, 200 BC. These are all examples of those different flattening mechanisms. And the reason there's so many is because there's this like, it's an impossible problem to try to solve. Like cartographers talk about the orange peel problem of like, you can't peel an orange and flatten it perfectly. Like something gets smushed, something's gonna get distorted. And so maps are always dealing with distortion in like proportion and scale. And I'm gonna have to skip forward on some of this stuff. Just to say that like the Mercator projection, which is the outline in black here, as an example of this is the one that we're most familiar with visually. It's the one Google Maps uses. It's the one that's printed on a lot of classroom walls. It's known to have a north-up bias, meaning that like if you look at the green mapping projection, which is called an equal area projection, meaning that even if it's distorted in terms of proportion to our eye, it's correct in terms of area, right? And so if you look at how much bigger Africa and South America are to North America and Europe than in that black outline version, this is just one example of how these kind of distortions show up. And cartographers and people are paying attention to this, because the way you tell these stories about this, it has a difference in who gets prioritized and who gets deprioritized in the stories that we're telling. And so the other thing I came across too in this research was like, I have never questioned why North is up before I was doing this research, right? And North being up is like totally about Chinese emperors and power structures, and it didn't always used to be up. South was up for a long time, and so the reason that North is up on maps today is mostly related to history and power. It's definitely not related to science, right? It's all about who wants to be on top of the map. And so that was like my thinking in this project, and maybe I'll skip through the rest of it after this, but the bigger nugget that I wanted to wrestle with in this painting series was like, how could I take that idea of that bias that I had so internalized I didn't even notice, and how could I use that as a lens to look at like other things, right? Like what is the bias in this or in other systems that we're interacting with every day that are so ingrained in it and that I'm not even seeing them, right? What is the north-up bias of this? And so, yeah, maybe I'll skip forward through here because I want to get to some other stuff. Here's me and my wife a long time ago. It makes sense if I'm telling the whole story. It led to me making this software, right? This is the short version of what this is. This is another part of the research where these cartographers that were looking at these distortion ideas in the 50s were thinking like, okay, if there's no perfect way to flatten the continents, what's another shape we can look at to talk about distortion? And they started putting the human profile in there to look at the human profile. But then this has problems also where like every example of this I could find historically and contemporary in software is always like a man's head, for example. So then this lens we're looking at distortion is also just flooded with this certain bias of looking at the world this other way. So I had this idea that if I could make a system where cartographers could use the profile of a human face, because there's no perfect, I don't know how you would make a face that would satisfy everybody, but if they could have a tool where they could use a face that they knew intimately, like their own face or a loved one's face, a family member's face, then that profile would be the one that a cartographer's eye would see any difference in, any distortion in. And so the beginning of this software I developed started as like many software, like the iWriter software was a piece of software made for one person. This software started with being made just for me, so the person whose face I see more than my own is my wife's face, and so it started with her face, and now her face is all over the place with my work. And so it resulted in this software, which I'll show briefly. It's also free software, it runs in a browser, it's at worldsandfigures.com. This was software I was using privately for like 3 years, developed by Cesar Mokaran, who's an artist who's doing really interesting work right now. And then I made it public when I released the work, and the very quick overview is like this drop-down menu, and this was also like kind of starting places, like okay, here's all these mapping projections from where I would try to note the year and kind of like different information about where it came from, but essentially these are all, you click on one of these and it shows you different ways of re-looking at the Earth, right? I can zoom in on this a little bit here. I can make the map a little bit more visible. So, I mean, right now we're looking at a equirectangular, or we can go look at that Mercator projection, it's up here. All different ways of like taking that data set, that sphere, and flattening it, right? But I also have controls for like who gets the center. So we can change who gets the center of the map, which may not be, you know, we can start warping this to give a different narrative, who gets up and down. There's different layers here, like this red line is that all red line I talked about. This layer is the fiber optic network, so we could, you know, we could make a map that looks just at the world as if it were, how would it look if we were just looking at those fiber optic routes. And so that software became what I used to make this painting series with. Oh man, okay, fast forward now. So I did this show, I released the work at the Berlin State Library. If you go to Berlin, it's still there, part of it is permanent. This was where I was doing the research, so they have a maps reading room, so I did this painting series that are, some of which still live within the periodicals of the maps reading room. You can see like a bent version of my wife's face in here. There's a mural that has to do with, you know, she's in there, the fiber optic cables, the all red lines in here. There's other systems for visualizing distortion, which are these dots. I'm gonna skip through the paintings. I wanna talk about skyscapes with my last, I'll go over a little bit.
That's fine.
So the last series I'm gonna talk about skyscapes, which is the video that's running on the other side here. And this also came from the software. Like I had this moment when I was spending a lot of time doing this, like in composing the paintings, kind of like the landscapes work, I was free when I was on the beach to let the camera move. The freedom I allowed myself here is like all the research led to the development of the software, so that when I'm in the software, I allowed myself to just think aesthetically, think visually. So I'd spend a lot of time like changing and looking through different mapping projections and like moving these sliders and these variables and turning on different layers. And I loved like just seeing how I felt like when I would move, and I could move my hand, and I would feel the math churning, and I would feel the sort of pull of the North and the South Pole, like, I felt like I understood these algorithms a little bit better, and that wasn't something that came across in the paintings as easily, and so we added an animation feature to the software, and so this is kind of like building off the painting series and going in a different direction. I was also getting more and more interested in like a more archetypal interest in that translation between sphere and plane is very related to this relationship between circle and square, which goes back through art history and architectural history, mathematics. There's like a lot of square-circle relationships, which I'd be happy to like nerd out on a lot too, but we can skip that. I was also going through living in Berlin and going through these winters, which look like this, and dealing with seasonal depression like everybody else in Berlin does. And so I started this rule set where when the sun would come out, I would go shoot photos of it. And this was just something I started doing. And that connected with my circles and squares and thinking about the sky and using this software. And so it all came together in this Skyscapes project, where another part of the project of the software, another functionality is like if I take a photo like this and I drag it into the software, it'll replace that base layer with any image, right? So what I did was essentially then turn off all the other data and just deal with manipulating photographs with this software and thinking about them kind of like in an animation way. So these are some of the examples. And so again, and then I started spending a lot of time shooting photographs and then spending even more time back in the software sort of playing with different variables and thinking about, I don't know, different projection algorithms to distort them with. Yeah, it's fun, I could keep going. Okay, I'm gonna skip that. And they turned into these pieces that you see here. They're dealing with slowness, which is another theme I got really interested in this last triptych of pieces are all projects that are dealing with slowness, like the landscapes, obviously these very slow videos. Painting falls within the canon of slowness because it's like a very slow image making process. Like it's one of the, like before photography, if you wanted to make an image, you had to sit down and paint it. It was this very slow process. You have to like, when you paint, right, you think about breathing and you think about the body and all these things that tie into it. And then these ones are also meant to be this very slow practice. Like slow practices to me are this like almost like a pushback against the sort of accelerationist tendencies that we're all dealing with all the time when we're engaging with these devices. And so that's where this series kind of led to. When I exhibit them, sometimes they show up sort of like screening room style. So far when I've exhibited them, they've all been local. So like this was in Modena in northern Italy. So like I would go there beforehand, shoot photos of that sky so that when people were looking at this, they were standing under the same sky that they were looking at. These ones on the left were from Turin, same thing. The right is in Berlin. So it's, so far I've been able to manage my schedule where I can do that, like go out, make new pieces, and usually when people are seeing them, they're, at least in the installation context, they're seeing the ones above their head. But then, and this is the last thing I'll leave you with, is like, both in the landscape series and in this one, there's like this net art side to it, where I have all the pieces that I've made in this series at this very clunky website, which is just open directories with all these weird links, but like when you click them, they all load in individual pieces and they just loop on full screen. And so the idea is that the exhibition, and at least in this case, part of its function is like a learning tool in my mind to be able to, for a smaller chunk of my audience, to then take those pieces back into the home, because I feel really strongly about living with work. It's like an experience I'd never had with art, because usually living with work means you have to have money to be able to buy work, which means most of us don't get a chance to have that experience. But net art, because it's like a primary interaction with the actual artwork, it's not a copy of it, right? And so net art has this affordance where we can live with it for free. And so in my own practice, I live with my work a lot. Students have heard me talk about this, but I really think you come to understand the work differently when you wake up to it every day over the course of a week or 3 weeks or 3 months. I try to live with my work 3 months before I exhibit it, and anyway, I could talk more about that, but I think there's real power there in art making, but also in art viewing. And so this is my kitchen. I have a monitor left over from an exhibition that I put next to where I wash dishes. And when the sun doesn't come out, I put these pieces on, and I really use it. I mean, I'm self-conscious about it when people come over and they see me like living with my own work. Seems obnoxious, but it really is like this another window. Like when the sun doesn't come out, or like when the sun sets at 3:30, like it does right now. I put these on, and it has this movement, it has this color, and it becomes this really slow thing that you can live with. So there's an invitation. You now know the URL. You can take these pieces home and try living with them. I think I'm gonna leave it there. That sort of concludes the Land, Earth, Sky series of triptychs I'm working on right now. And yeah, like some of these themes, like agency, openness, the unseen, this idea of bias, they're like these looser threads that maybe aren't exactly like a thesis statement like you're dealing with writing about one work, but they're like bits and pieces of thesis statements from multiple works that have sort of like come to stick with a lot of the work that I've made over the years. I'm gonna leave it there. For people that are on Zoom or are not part of the classroom, an invitation to mark your calendar for May 16th, when Thesis will have its exhibition. There'll be more details coming soon, but the Parsons Paris Art Media Instagram, I assume, will be posting that when it's more public. I think I'll end it there. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks for sticking around after class.
And
Thanks for everybody online.
Questions.
And yeah, we have time for questions.
Yes. So thank you.